Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Lobo Annual number 1 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 1 of Bloodlines. 30 years ago saw the release of the last great annual crossover, spanning the breadth of DC's publishing slate and launching dozens of new characters, almost all of whom amounted to very little, with one glaring exception. For myself, I acknowledge my bias up front. I have a great deal of affection for annual crossovers. Atlantis Attacks was Marvel's annual crossover in 1989, the year I dove headlong into superhero comics. Every issue of that was an event for young me, and to this day I hold it as an exemplary specimen of crossover structure and execution. Bloodlines, on the contrary, is generally not fondly remembered by those who remember it at all. In hindsight, it wouldn't be that far off the mark to conclude that Bloodlines killed the format entirely. Marvel had already moved on from annual crossovers by this time. Interestingly, both Marvel and DC's 1993 annuals had the same theme of introducing new characters, but only DC put together an overarching narrative to fit all the new characters. For what it's worth, Marvel's hit-to-miss ratio was more or less comparable to DC's. DC at least made the effort to push a few of these folks, whereas the standouts of Marvel's initiative were the Genusville Captain Marvel, the Executioner, and Adam X the Extreme. But back to Bloodlines. Almost all the individual annuals were designed to be read standalone, with the overarching plot an alien invasion via infiltration on the part of 6 shape-shifting alien monsters, called simply parasites. Now, to get the obvious out of the way, the monsters were heavily influenced by the famous xenomorphs of the Alien movie franchise, from their Giger-esque organic spaceship through to their habit of feeding on their victims with a second mouth that shoots like a spring from within their first mouth. However, despite that clear influence, the parasites were still an interesting visual in their own right, having been designed by Art Adams. Frankly, brightly colored dragon parasites from space wasn't a bad hook for a team of villains. Unlike the aforementioned xenomorphs, they weren't pure carnivores, however. They were specifically concerned with sucking the spinal fluid out of their victims. Most people died from the assault, except for a small percentage who were subsequently reborn, with superpowers of greater or lesser utility. The responsibility of launching the storyline falls to the ever-incorrigible Lobo, in his capacity as a member of the Legion peacekeeping force. While hunting down the nefarious Poiple gang for having stolen his bike, Lobo and a team of figurative red shirts follow the Poiple gang to a mysterious spacecraft that appears from a rift in the fabric of space. We find the parasites hibernating in their chambers, from whence they proceed to systematically hunt and devour both the Poiple gang as well as the larger part of the Legion expedition force. Lobo survives, of course, because apparently his spinal fluid tastes unmistakably foul, and so does the annual's new character, Layla. A punk with a purple mohawk, Layla awakens following her bite to find herself endowed with superhuman strength and durability, pretty basic as far as superpowers go. Alan Grant does an able job of teeing up the rest of the story, carrying water for a great deal of exposition while introducing a raft of new characters. Christian Alamy drew a fine Lobo, and for all that it needs to accomplish in service of the crossover, it's a very nice-looking comic book. Alamy does an excellent job with Adam's designs, setting a high bar for the summer. The most important thing to take away from this book is that ultimately it is 100% Lobo's fault that the aliens come to Earth in the first place, so good job for that. As for this issue's new blood, Layla was introduced as a new recruit of Vril Dox's Legion organization, but apparently didn't have a lot to do as she appeared only a few times in the last year of that book. After Legion switched to Rebels, she was shuffled off to limbo almost completely, appearing in that book only twice. According to DCFandom.com, she appeared in a total of 11 comics and hasn't appeared in anything for almost 30 years. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Superman the Man of Steel, Annual number 2 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 2 of Bloodlines. The massacre hits Earth as the alien parasites in their spaceship crash down just outside of Metropolis. In doing so, they also crash another crossover altogether. The early stages of Bloodlines overlap with the events of 1993's Reign of the Superman. Now, 1993 was a packed slate for just about everyone in the comics industry, a brief high-water mark just preceding the disastrous crash. And as far as the era's events go, it must be said that Reign of the Superman is far better remembered than Bloodlines. People still like the death and return of Superman cycle, and the characters introduced during that event remain staples of the line to this day. Today's Man of Steel annual hit stands just 1 month into the Reign storyline, and features the character who had just become, at least for a few months, the putative main character in the Man of Steel monthly book, John Henry Irons, known today as Steel. Accordingly, this annual is also written by Irons' co-creator, Louise Simonson, and drawn by Eddie Newell. Newell is most notable for his run as the artist on the mid-90s Black Lightning series, with early credits at indie publishers like Now and Innovation. At the time, no one knew which of the four characters fighting under the Superman rubric would go the distance, or even how the Man of Tomorrow's ultimate return would be affected. But it's worth noting that, just 1 month after his creation, Irons was already a distinctive and fleshed-out individual. His purpose after taking on the Superman mantle was fairly straightforward: being more receptive to the needs of the less fortunate metropolis, many of whom had been further disenfranchised during the rebuilding and economic redevelopment that followed Doomsday's initial attack. Accordingly, this issue features Irons as Superman tracking down missing persons in a poor area of town. A hunt that leads them to a heap of dead bodies, the remains of a killing spree by the parasite Angon. This issue continues to establish the personalities of the individual parasites. They're not all undifferentiated monsters, though social creatures with a definite pecking order and defined rivalries. The aliens' first victims on Earth are a group of motorcyclists who happen to see the crash of the parasite ship, and with the knowledge of just how delicious the natives actually are, the group proceeds to fan out across the continent. Angon, whose human form is an intimidating woman with long red hair, is powerful and impulsive, so she's the first one to set out for population centers. This issue introduces the new hero Edge, the erstwhile Tom O'Brien. O'Brien drops out of high school to take care of his younger siblings and befriends Irons at the neighborhood gym where the new Man of Steel steps in for his reps. After Angon's attack kills O'Brien, we see a soon-to-be familiar pattern. Initially just another victim, the attack triggers O'Brien's metagene, and he wakes up with strange powers as well as no memory of his previous life. His powers are actually pretty awful. He becomes a human porcupine, growing knives all over his skin, making it impossible even to wear clothes without wrapping the rags in cords. He manages to figure out how to hug his little brother by retracting the knives when he touches other people, but the fact that he has to concentrate to do it doesn't bode well for his personal life going forward. Although it's tolerable as a very early appearance for a character who would go on to much greater success later, it's hardly an essential chapter in the John Henry Irons story. As for this issue's New Blood, Edge, history was not kind. Following his debut here, he appears only 3 more times in the course of the Bloodlines storyline, and then only twice more after that, with nothing more recent than 1994. According to DCFandom.com, he appeared in a total of only 6 comics ever, providing for us an early example of just how forgettable most of the characters from the storyline would turn out to be. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman Shadow of the Bat Annual number 1 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 3 of Bloodlines. Now, 3 weeks into our adventure, were you beginning to get the idea that Bloodlines was all terrible? It really wasn't, but the best parts of it had precious little to do with the main storyline and everything to do with the luck of the draw in terms of creators who just happened to be roped into the proceedings. By way of illustration, we point to the penciler of this week's installment, none other than the great Trevor Von Eeden himself, inked by Dick Giordano. It should go without saying that this is one of the best looking comics you're likely to find. It also just happens to feature Batman fighting an intergalactic parasite. Last week we discussed the fact that Bloodlines happens to intersect with the events following the death of Superman, with the space monsters each facing one of the faux Supermen, beginning with last week's John Henry Irons adventure. Well, Bloodlines also overlaps with another massive crossover, albeit to much less pronounced effect. Today's Batman Annual has to coincide with the opening salvos of Nightfall. Although the events of that crossover aren't mentioned, the Batman books maintained a tight continuity for months leading up to that crossover, which, if you recall, opened only after Batman was already worn down by ceaseless exertion. There was close enough continuity between the main DC Universe books at the time that we know if the parasites arrived in time to fight Irons at the beginning of his career as Superman, Batman had to already be in a state of exhaustion by the time the parasites arrived. And we also know that later in the event, none other than the Azrael Batman himself steps up to fight the monsters as well. So, although it's not mentioned in the main story, you can feel free to slot in Batman's encounters with these alien monsters, most likely among his various ordeals leading up to the destruction of Arkham Asylum in Batman 491, a book which, notably, hit stands 3 months prior to this issue. This issue introduces us to Joe Public, an interesting new character in the context of these annuals, for being someone who is already dressed up as a superhero. We see Joe Public's first outing here, breaking up a drug deal that was already being surveilled by Batman. Batman takes a taser shot because Joe Public stumbles into the fight, and with that kind of auspicious beginning, Batman tells Joe to head on home and get a new hobby. Of course, that doesn't take, and while searching for the missing shipment of narcotics, he finds himself swept up by Gamir in his form of a massive red dragon soaring through the skies above Gotham. He's set up a larder on an islet in an abandoned bunker in Gotham Harbor, stowing corpses and soon-to-be corpses away from the mainland. Joe's powers involve stealing vigor from other people in his vicinity. Limited use in a group setting, it must be said. There's another player here in the form of Tegan, a female martial arts
sports hero who appeared a handful of times during Alan Grant's run on Batman, but never after. Honestly, Tegan, with a narrow focus on protecting women from assault, is a more appealing character than Joe Public. Batman even seems to approve of her, but she hasn't been seen since a tiny cameo in Dan Slott's Arkham Asylum series 20 years ago. Still, as far as annuals go, this issue counts as a win for being a giant-sized comic book drawn by Trevor Von Eden at the height of his powers. Not every inker gets Von Eden, but Giordano comes through here, and the result is a gorgeous book that reads like $1,000,000. Extra props to Adrian Roy for coming through with the colors. Von Eden likes to leave negative space for the colorist to play, and she knows just how to make his exquisitely designed layouts pop. As for this issue's new blood, Joe Public, once again, there isn't a lot to be said. A couple desultory appearances following the end of the crossover weren't enough to pump anyone's interest for further adventures. According to DCFandom.com, he appeared in only 8 comics, 2 more than last week's Edge, but still, nothing at all in the last 29 years.
Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Flash Annual number 6 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 4 of Bloodlines. With 3 chapters in the book so far, we've encountered stories of variable quality, with generally decent art written by creators who honestly seemed only about half invested in the annual conceit, by which I mean it's apparently not all that difficult to write a story where random superheroes become involved with space parasites for a few dozen pages. The real challenge has been the mandate to concoct a new character out of the carnage. So far, we've seen good creators skating through on the technicality of having created new characters that they had no intention of ever using for anything. Lila was created to be used as a supporting character in a book that didn't really seem to need more supporting cast and was about to be canceled. Joe Public was yet another Gotham-based crime fighter in a family of books without enough space for the crime fighters they already had, and poor Edge, no one had any use for the guy made of knives. This Flash Annual, then, is far ahead of the game for actually putting in the work of creating a character the main book could use. Of the 4 chapters of Bloodlines we've read, this is by far the most successful story. Not only does it use the alien parasites well, showing off their personalities and even their passive-aggressive interactions, but it actually spends time to build up the new guy. And this issue goes above and beyond the call of duty for an annual crossover. If the Batman and Superman annuals we've seen so far were notable for the degree to which they avoided placing themselves on any kind of concrete timeline in relation to the major crossovers occurring at the time, this Flash Annual, arriving as it did at the climax of the Flash's own Return of Barry Allen saga, tells us right on the first page that it takes place prior to issue 78 of The Flash. The real reason why this annual is a cut above so much of the rest, however, is the art by then-rookie Phil Hester. Hester had been knocking around the indies for a few years prior to his first DC work, with pages under his belt for publishers like Malibu, Now, Caliber, and Dark Horse. Prior to this, which I believe is his first ever DC work. Not his last, however, as the following year would see him take the helm for a lengthy run on Swamp Thing, working with the very young Mark Millar. His art here is quite strong, stylish and moody for a character not always renowned for stylish and moody art. Argus is a conscious attempt at a new hero in the mold of a daredevil, with a little bit of Donnie Brasco as well, a deep undercover cop who almost gets his cover blown, but is saved by the timely intervention of a parasite attack. He wakes to find himself transformed into a guy who can turn invisible in the dark and see every part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Not a bad power set, definitely superior to being made of knives. Argus was actually built to be used, and so became an actual member of the supporting cast of Mark Waid's lengthy run on The Flash. What's more, he received his own 6-issue limited series a couple years after the conclusion of Bloodlines, partially drawn by his co-creator Hester. According to DCFandom.com, he's appeared 27 times over the years, although nothing since 2009. With that strong connection to The Flash, however, even money says he might well pop up again somewhere down the line, possibly even drawn again by his co-creator Hester. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at New Titans Annual number 9 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 5 of Bloodlines. Inasmuch as so far we've looked at a number of stories sharing a number of similar traits, this chapter of Bloodlines breaks the mold for much of what has come before. In the first place, it should be stressed that one of the surprising strengths of the crossover to date is that most chapters were written by the same person writing the monthly book. This New Titans Annual, however, was not written by Marv Wolfman, nor does it seem particularly relevant towards what was happening in the actual book at the time. For proof of this, you need look no further than the
house ad later in the book, pointing the reader towards New Titans 100, a milestone in the later stretch of Wolfman's Titans, and completely removed from the events here. If last week's Flash Annual seemed unusual for presenting the first appearance of a character the creators actually wanted to use, a low bar we will see creators struggle to reach throughout the event, this week's story goes a full step further in presenting the first appearance of a character clearly earmarked for much bigger things. Yes, you heard that correctly. This issue marks the first appearance of Anima, the first character premiere from the pages of Bloodlines, expressly intended to launch a new series. Accordingly, the writers here are new, not just to the Titans or DC in general, but to comics. New Titans Annual 9 is listed as the first comics credit for both Paul Whitcover and Elizabeth Hand, two prose writers teaming up to launch the character here, and who would soon reconvene to write her solo series beginning later that year and running 16 issues. Again, this flies in the face of much of what people remember about Bloodlines, that it featured the premiere of a group of characters clearly created to be killed in crowd scenes of later crossovers. Anima feels like a character with a great deal of intention behind her, an attempt to appeal fully to the kind of alt crowd that was just then, in 1993, being identified as a burgeoning and lucrative demographic. Anima's big characterization here is wearing an L7 pin and name-dropping Bikini Kill and Pond. Interesting cultural shorthand that marks Courtney Mason as the kind of person who would probably much have preferred to read the early Vertigo line, also premiering that year, over mainstream DC. Now, we're almost 500 words into this review, and I haven't even mentioned what the Titans are doing. They're busy being shoehorned into this very packed story. The team just happens to be called down to New Orleans to help prevent an environmental disaster at one of Steve Dayton's research facilities. They also just happen to stumble across the machinations of the alien parasites, who have themselves stumbled into being worshipped by a voodoo priest who usually specializes in performing religious ceremonies for tourists. Somehow, in this mess, Courtney Mason runs away from home and is murdered by a parasite before waking up with the power to absorb the life energy of those around her and use it to summon a magic creature named Animus, a power straight out of JoJo's Bizarre Adventures. As far as the comic itself, it's surprisingly quite nice looking. Artist Malcolm Davis goes for broke with a script that has way too much plot. His creative and dynamic layouts find their complement in Patricia Mulvihill's truly sublime colors, neons and pinks and yellows against the backdrop of the Big Easy. If ever there was a book I'd recommend reading solely on the basis of the coloring, it's this. Now, as far as the New Blood go, Anima might very well be the second most successful launch of the line. With a total of 38 appearances, according to the ever-reliable DCFandom.com, Courtney Mason managed a respectable run by any measure. Of course, she was last seen being murdered by Prometheus in 2009, which places her death firmly in the shadow of another infinitely regrettable crossover, Cry for Justice. Still, even given that particularly ignominious end, it would be hard to argue she didn't beat the spread for a New Blood. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Superman Annual number 5 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 6 of Bloodlines. Today's chapter takes the novel approach of almost completely ignoring the main plot of Bloodlines. This annual is furthermore indexed to a very specific moment in time. That is, the early chapters of the reign of the Supermen, during which the cyborg Superman was still masquerading as the returned hero. There's reference to the cyborg meeting President Clinton, which occurred in Superman number 79. By the following month, Superman 80, the masquerade was dropped and the cyborg revealed to be Hank Henshaw in league with Mongol and committing mass murder via the destruction of Coast City. What's more, the main focus of the story is actually following up on a dangling thread from earlier in the Death and Return cycle, from Superman number 77, the murder of Sasha Green. Green was Lex Luthor's martial arts instructor, who made the mistake of showing up her boss in front of Supergirl and Lois Lane. In return, she was brutally murdered on panel by Lex. Her body's unceremoniously dumped in a landfill, which is where our friends the alien parasites come in. They find Sasha Green's corpse and feast on its spinal fluid. The small matter of her already being dead is incidental. After assault at Luthor's hands and the defilement of her corpse by alien monsters, she wakes up in the city dump with strange powers and no memories. The parasites walk away and are not seen again, appearing for a total of 6 pages. Sasha's powers are, in essence, very similar to Rogue's. Touching another person's skin overwrites her own brain with their memories, skills, and personality. Now, you may be thinking that's not a half-bad setup for a character, someone with a very specific grudge against Lex Luthor and the desire to regain her lost memories, who ends the story faking her death in a helicopter crash and vowing revenge. But despite being set up to play an important role in the Superman books going forward, she never appears in them again. One more appearance in Bloodlines, and while her murder is mentioned again in the Superman books, Myriad the character simply disappears, for a total of 4 appearances according to DC
DCFandom.com. For all that this storyline is lambasted for having raised up a crop of ciphers, poorly conceived characters destined to die in the background of larger stories, it's another kind of sin altogether to create a character with an interesting premise and strong hook and completely discard them. Dan Jurgens wrote this, so you can't say he wasn't at the heart of the Superman office at the time. He apparently had no desire to follow up on a character seemingly set up with larger things in mind. However, as strange as it may seem, this annual does represent an important milestone. David Lapham's first DC work, and his only work for the mainstream Big Two for the first 15 years of his career. This annual shipped in the interregnum between the end of his tenure at Valiant and the advent of Defiant Comics, for whom he'd go on to draw Warriors of Plasm. From Defiant, he was on to his own creator-owned Stray Bullets, and he wouldn't be back at DC until 2004. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Green Lantern Annual number 2 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 7 of Bloodlines. So far, despite Bloodlines' reputation as an absolute stinker, I've been pleasantly surprised to find many of the individual chapters much better than their reputation. So far, we've encountered the likes of Trevor Von Eaton, Phil Hester, Christian Alamy, and David Lapham. No slouches in any respect. Even the lesser efforts have been readable or offered something interesting, like the memorably intense Patricia Mulvihill color in that Titans Annual. But here, friends, the rubber well and truly hits the road. Green Lantern Annual number 2 is not a very good comic book, and more to the point, it's not a good comic book in a way that is indicative of a definite malaise at the company at the time. 1993 was, as I think we've discussed, a big year for DC. This was the year the industry imploded, and while it would be difficult to describe any winners emerging from a disaster that destroyed a large chunk of the industry, the fact is that of all the companies publishing comics at the time, DC was the only one publishing stories that are still read and referenced today. The death and return of Superman was, despite being the most desperate gimmick of them all, a popular storyline that has never fallen out of print. And likewise with Batman's Nightfall, even if the follow-ups to that weren't quite so popular. All of which brings us to Green Lantern, who was at this very moment in his history struggling mightily. And it's not hard to see why. This is Hal Jordan we're talking about, mere months before Emerald Twilight completely scrambled the character and his mythos. I've never made any secret of my antipathy towards Hal, and it's to a large degree because this was the Hal I read about as a kid. A stodgy schmuck with gray temples who bounces in a desultory fashion between the worst love interest in comics, while also somehow still hanging out with Aricia. To top off the general regrettably error, this is the most inappropriately sexual chapter in the Bloodline so far. Whereas none of the parasites have to date shown any interest in relations with humans, this issue shows Lysick seducing and actually having sex with some of her victims. Victims who are primarily women, it should be said. Her victims' husbands, meanwhile, are hypnotized into starting a gang to fight her enemies, a useless complication to the series' high concept. This issue's new blood is the wonderfully named Nightblade, assaulted by Lysick in the hospital and gaining the power of super regeneration, meaning he can regrow arms and legs in just a few moments. His first instinct upon finding his family murdered by a parasite and the neighborhood man converted to an alien cult is to make a bunch of throwing knives so he can stab people, which makes about as much sense as anything in this story. For Hal's part, this comic was printed as the plans were being finalized for his Emerald Twilight, a process which saw the first version of the already solicited Green Lantern 50 scrapped entirely in favor of jettisoning the character for the entirely new Kyle Rayner. This issue saw print the month before Coast City got blown up by Mongol. As discussed last week, and in hindsight it makes sense that they'd be motivated to rip up the whole thing and start from scratch. Meanwhile, Nightblade actually beat the spread and appeared in a full 17 comics, according to DCFandom.com. He joins the Blood Pack team that starts up soon, and many years later holds the dubious honor of both dying at the hands of Superboy Prime in Infinite Crisis and coming back as a Black Lantern in Blackest Night. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman Annual number 17 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 8 of Bloodlines. If last week's Green Lantern Annual presents an example of the worst-case scenario for what can happen when a mandatory crossover tie-in barges into an already creatively innovated series, then I'm pleased to report that this week's installment presents a much more salutary specimen. This week's Batman Annual features a strange moment in the history of the Caped Crusader, albeit illustrated by a heavyweight. Our comic Outbreak today is drawn by the great Eduardo Barreto, one of DC's greatest artists, veteran of the new Teen Titans, Superman, and yes, Batman as well. Barreto marked a clean midpoint between the effortless lyricism of Garcia Lopez and the mannered baroque of George Perez. A fantastic action storyteller above all else. But, as I said, this issue offers a snapshot of a strange moment, by which I mean this is one of the handful of ancillary stories to take place in the brief window of time between Batman's back being broken by Bane in Batman 497 and the debut of the new Batman's armored costume in Batman 500. The Batman who faces the alien parasites here is Jean-Paul Vallée, early in his tenure. I read through Nightfall again a few years back and was pleased to find the story held up better than expected. Vallée began as a psychologically unbalanced charity case, someone taken in by Bruce Wayne in the months leading to Nightfall, a traumatized orphan who was never, ever intended to become Batman. And then in Batman 498, after Batman's defeat, a desperate Robin makes the fateful mistake of giving Vallée a Batman costume to wear so he could be seen as Batman by other people in a supervised capacity in the wake of the real Batman's very public trouncing. The moment he puts on the costume, however, Jean-Paul begins to lose touch with reality, falls out with Robin, and starts listening to the voices in his head. Of course, Commissioner Gordon has no idea about any of this, and so has no choice but to take Batman at face value when bodies start dropping across town as a result of a new serial killer. The trust or lack thereof between Batman and the Gotham PD is crucial to the plot. The moment he comes into contact with the monster, Batman, even the Vallée Batman, understands the threat as being beyond the capabilities of local law enforcement, and he tells Gordon directly. But an ill-fated SWAT unit winds up responding to a call anyway and getting completely dismantled by a parasite, leaving only one member of the team alive, this week's new blood, Kelvin Mao, aka Ballistic. He's got armor plating all over his body and seems to be about as durable as the parasites themselves. He's not the kind of guy the normal Batman would willingly team up with, being a former cop and a firearms enthusiast, that is. But Jean-Paul Vallée is just making it up at this point, so in lieu of a real plan, this will have to do. So our dynamic duo set about luring the alien to an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, one they can blow up to their heart's content. Doug Mensch is one of the great Batman writers, and even under the unusual circumstances of a fill-in Batman fighting a monster from outer space, the results are much stronger than they have any right to be. As for Ballistic, DCFandom.com tells us 24 appearances total, including as part of the Blood Pact. Not a bad career, although he would go on to suffer an ignominious demise at the hands of Superboy Prime prior to being resurrected as a Black Lantern.
Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Justice League International Annual number 4 from 1993 in DC Comics, Chapter 9 of Bloodlines. And so we reach the end of the first movement of Bloodlines. The first 9 of these annuals were labeled as the Outbreak, with the second group labeled as the Earth Plague and the third Death Storm. However, despite the ratcheting of stakes implied by that schema, there's not really much in the way of change to the overarching story. Anyone hoping that the story might present a more cohesive master plot will be disappointed, as Bloodlines refuses to cohere in that respect until the very end. To be fair, that kind of minute story-to-story coordination is a hard thing for any crossover. Properly organizing a tight plot across 23 different annuals would be frankly prohibitive. So we remain stuck in the same holding pattern. The monsters show up somewhere and begin killing people. Heroes get involved in the search for a mysterious killer, and a new schmuck shows up at some point in the proceedings. So too with today's entry, featuring the Justice League International. 1993 was a long way from 1987. Giffen and DeMatteis were already gone, and the gimmick of having many worldwide branches of a Justice League organization largely driven by bureaucrats had already begun to pay drastically diminished dividends. The idea of the JLI as a group of lighthearted adventurers based in jolly old England was not long for this world, and the Justice League as a concept would suffer a few more years in the wilderness before Grant Morrison happened along. The real appeal to today's comic is in the art. The great Mike Parobeck, taken from us at the absurdly young age of 30. At a time when Batman the Animated Series was still new and controversial, Parobeck was one of the few artists not merely to adapt that style, but to foreshadow it himself. His work still reads remarkable, visionary in scope, even on an absolute trifle such as this. Today's book presents an eclectic iteration of the team, the Elongated Man, Metamorpho, and the Tasmanian Devil, primarily joined by this issue's new guy, Lionheart. Now, as far as the rules of the crossover go, Lionheart actually does present an interesting variation. His origin as a superhero doesn't involve the parasites at all. He's supposedly a descendant of Richard I,
coast, possessing some great wellspring of British courage, press ganged by a mysterious group of English anti-globalists trying to push foreign superheroes out of the country. Now, if we're being frank, Distant Descendants has to be one of my least favorite tropes in all of fiction, since in reality, if Richard Plantagenet had produced any offspring, which is, I believe, in doubt, his descendants would number in the many millions, so one random dude wouldn't be all that special. Anyway, although he's assaulted in a later attack, Lionheart doesn't seem to gain any powers from the ordeal. He's still just a guy with a sword. He did show up a few times, however, in the pages of the next couple years of Justice League books, for a total of 16 appearances total, which isn't bad for someone who avoided the Blood Pack.